We pay, forgot to say, this will be recorded. If you have any questions or concerns, please let us know. We pay homage to those who were here before us on this land, the 7 Anishinaabe nations of the Chippewa and Ojibwe and the 4 Dakota nations. Along with these 11 tribes, we honor all the indigenous peoples of this territory, many from tribes which were never formally recognized by the federal government. Furthermore, by respecting our purpose for being here today, it is also important to acknowledge our Black ancestors who were taken from their homeland and brought here involuntarily to build this nation as we know it. We acknowledge those before us, those among us, and those who are yet to come. And as a foundation, we have a very critical role in acknowledging our history and are responsible for the journey in healing, resourcing, and reparations. So with that, I will pass it over. Before that, sorry. A little bit about the Women's Foundation. Okay, so the Women's Foundation on the next slide, we are the first statewide foundation dedicated to gender and racial justice since 1983. And we have been funding transformative futures for women, girls, and gender expansive people. We so far have invested in $45 million across the state. And on the next slide is a little bit about how we do our work. And on the next slide is our impact areas. So we invest in grantee partners like OutFront through leadership and community power, economic justice, holistic well-being and reproductive justice, as well as safety, all of which is interconnected and intersectional in our work. And I will pass it now over to Kat to speak a little bit about OutFront in the next slide. Kat?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thanks, of course, to the Women's Foundation of Minnesota for supporting OutFront Minnesota and our work. OutFront is our state's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization. We were founded in 1987, so we've been around for more than 35 years. And we do work across multiple different areas of policy in schools and supporting folks through our anti-violence program. We've worked on a lot of different policy wins over the years that are noted here. This year, especially highlighting our work on the conversion therapy ban and the trans refuge bills that were passed into law this year, which we're very excited about. But we continue to do work to ensure that Minnesota is an equitable place for our LGBTQ plus communities, both here in the Twin Cities and throughout the state. So really excited to be joining everybody and to be joined by 2 fantastic guests who will help in this great conversation.
Great, thanks, Kat. So may I introduce our speakers today. In the next slide, you'll see who's joining us. We have, sorry, one second, TL Jordan, and they're an organizing manager at Planned Parenthood for Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota Action Fund. They're a queer trans educator, instructor in women and gender studies at Winona State University, and academic studying the connections between trans rights and reproductive rights. And we also have Erin Quade, who is a special projects advisor at Gender Justice, where she works to advance gender justice through public education, legislative outreach, strategic partnerships, and coalition building. Thank you so much for joining us, TL and Erin. I'll pass it back to Kat.
Excellent. Well, today's conversation is about the intersections between reproductive justice and gender-affirming care. And I just want to start off by just kind of grounding as we talk about this. We'll probably talk through a number of different pieces of terminology and things like that. But TL, if you wanted to start in sharing, like, what is gender-affirming care and what is reproductive care, and then we can kind of start this conversation of why they might intersect at all.
Yeah, I can kick us off. So, gender affirming care, for those who aren't familiar, is any kind of medical, mental, emotional support that you get in order to affirm the gender that you are and support the identity. And that, like I kind of alluded to, can range from like medical procedures like HRT, hormone replacement therapy, or it could be social. It could be, getting therapy that aligns with you, but it also is being able to access like medical care that is informed by your gender, your body, and the way that it exists in the world. And so then tied with kind of reproductive justice and thinking about the right to, very specifically in thinking reproductive, the right to have children, not have children, and choose the ways in which you want to have or not have kids, as well as being able to raise people and raise children in environments that are safe, happy, and healthy. But I like to think that both of them are just rooted in autonomy, the right to choose what you want to do with your body, how you want to do it, the right to be able to get the medical care that you need that is informed by your choices, the way you want to live your life, and the identities that you hold.
Erin, you want to share a little bit about the intersection of these two things? Why might we talk about them together in the first place? Where's the overlap?
Well, I would say they're like in the Venn diagram, they're like a full circle, right? So reproductive justice, that or an organizing framework that was created and moved by Black women in the 90s. And TL did a great job just naming those four primary principles, right? The right to have a child, the right to not have a child, the right to parent children you choose to have in safe and sustainable communities, and then crucially, gender freedom and bodily autonomy, because you can't do any of those other things if you don't have gender freedom, bodily autonomy. And, in addition to these being, to me, the exact same fight, they're also the threats to gender freedom, bodily autonomy, and reproductive justice are being perpetrated by the same people. And so I think there's a lot of work that, we have done in Minnesota to make sure that we are not separating out the fight for gender affirming care and trans liberation from the reproductive justice movement, right? They are the same movement, and we will not let them be separated out. So that's something I'm really proud of us for having continued to do in Minnesota, and we'll continue working on that.
100%. So I'll drop a quick link in the chat for those who aren't familiar with it. The Guttmacher Institute just put out a recent survey looking at LGBTQ folks and experiences with reproductive care access, specifically abortion access, and found that roughly 16% of people who are having abortions don't identify as heterosexual women. And just for context, that means, folks who identify as bisexual, primarily lesbians, trans folks, non-binary folks, all these sorts of folks who are often left out of that reproductive freedom conversation at a sort of national level. And I think, I take pride here in Minnesota that our conversations and that our organizing work has been more inclusive of that for a longer period of time. But nationally, when we talk about things like reproductive justice and abortion access, it's still often framed in a very, sort of narrow band of what that looks like, who might need that care, and why they might access that care. So TL, I would love to hear from you just a little bit more about, what does it mean to sort of expand that narrative of who might access reproductive care specifically?
Yeah, and I think, a lot of folks are on what I would kind of consider like our first steps, which is using inclusive language when we're talking about reproductive care and when we're talking about abortion, because it isn't just women, it is trans people, it's queer people, it's men who need access to all of these things. So, but I also want to caution and say we can't stop there. Using gender neutral language alone is not trans inclusion in reproductive spaces. It is a beginning. It's those first steps. So, it looks like making sure that when, trans people go into an OB-GYN appointment, that they're getting care that is, conscious of maybe dysphoria or conscious of what types of body and what situations, because trans people are not a monolith. We're not, we all have different goals in our transition, and that also might mean we have different goals in our reproductive care and the type of care we might want, or the type of care that feels good or doesn't feel good. And so informing providers and making sure that it is safe spaces, or at least as safe as we can make them, because doctor's offices are not always the best spaces in the world. But, you know, so it's this mix of like transforming our care and making sure our providers and, you know, our medical records are as aligned as possible, but also this other side of kind of being on innovative of what does it look like for trans people to get reproductive care? Because again, that might look very, very different depending on the person's goals. Well, one, you know, and I keep coming back to this, trans people, you know, like can get pregnant. Trans people can have families, and not all trans people find that as opposed to their gender, despite what people may think. And so I think making sure that we are including, and we are thinking that often I think trans people get seen as not capable of pregnancy or not desiring it. And that is definitely not true.
Yeah, as a trans person and a parent, I have 2 kids. I made a very clear and distinct choice to have kids and to build a family. And so many trans folks are just left out of those conversations around our families and our bodies and our autonomy. And so it's wonderful to have that space and make those expansive spaces where we can make those choices, whether or not we want to have kids, and be part of those conversations. Erin, I think one of the things that I often hear, you know, like some nervousness around folks is like, well, if we spend all this time sort of navigating these spaces, are we like sort of undermining the cause or taking away from centering, you know, conversations around women's bodies? How do you approach that in your work? How do you navigate that sort of like nervousness that folks might have about creating a more inclusive sort of dialogue around reproductive rights?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few parts to it. One is that, you know, we know that if we are not using inclusive language, that we're specifically leaving people out of this conversation that are part of it, right? And so it's always like a specific choice to leave people out of a conversation. And so you never want to be having a conversation about an inclusive movement that was designed to be an inclusive movement and then using exclusive language. But the other part too is that like, the reason why, and I understand it, right? When I was actually just rereading, I have my reproductive justice book by Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger, and they have this whole part about like a note about language and gender. And it's okay for us to acknowledge that the site of so much violence is rooted in a uterus, right? And it is about the oppression of what we have traditionally called woman, but we understand that woman is actually its own self-defining category, and not everybody who has a uterus identifies as a woman. Not every person who can get pregnant identifies as a woman. And so this really isn't, I mean, it is rooted in the patriarchy, it's rooted in oppression. And so when we get into like what we say and what we don't say, we're like missing the point. We're missing what the point of it is. And the point of it is to control the lives, bodies, and futures of women, femmes, and people with uteruses. And so specifically when we're talking about abortion, but broadly, it does include LGBTQ people, it includes non-binary and trans people, and it is to control and ultimately, I think, push us out of the entire existence in the country. And so I think that we miss the point if we try to quibble over, like if we don't say woman, then like no one will know what we're talking about. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Actually, and I'll end on this. They just did research that showed that it was polling and like scientific research that showed that if you say like, you know, people who are pregnant or women who are pregnant, there is no differentiation in the broader public's mind about who we're talking about when we use inclusive language, as long as we use it comfortably. Like if we stumble over it, they'll be like, why are you struggling with this? But if you just use it naturally, there is no drop or increase in support for reproductive rights, health, and justice. People understand exactly what we're talking about. So that is a scientific reason, in addition to all the good ones, to just use gender inclusive language.
100%. And I think, you know, we sort of skirted around the outsides of what the reality is, that the folks who are opposed to gender affirming rights and care are the same folks who are opposed to abortion access and reproductive rights and care. And, you know, I think, you know, reflecting back a year ago as we were all sitting and, you know, kind of reflecting on the Dobbs decision that came out and figuring out like, what is the space in our movement right now? What do we need to do? How do we need to respond to this moment? I think one of the, you know, really critical parts as an LGBTQ org, you know, we had been involved in reproductive rights work here as part of the Unrestrict Coalition and in a number of different spaces. But looking through that decision, you know, there was a clear call out from some of the conservatives on the court to not just roll back Roe v. Wade, but to go further and to look at some of the other case law that is found founded on the same sort of bodily autonomy and privacy decisions. Roll back things like same-sex marriage equality, roll back Lawrence v. Texas, which, outlawed sodomy laws across the country. And these are exactly the kinds of spaces where we see that intersection. There's no distinction for the opponents of reproductive rights that, this is any different from any other layers of controlling folks' bodies. And, I think for me and the way that OutFront has approached this is that, if we get into sort of the technicalities of all these things on a continuous basis, like trying to argue the specifics of gender-affirming care, or trying to argue the specifics of abortion care or reproductive rights care, we're always going to lose, because there's always going to be this space where people can find their sort of out of like, I'm not comfortable with this, or I'm not comfortable with that, or I'm going to buy this really technical argument. But when we talk about those fundamental values of like being able to make decisions about your body, being able to have choices and freedom, being able to work with doctors who are experts on this instead of with lawmakers making broad strokes about it, it gives us the space to get away from those technical arguments and get to the sort of values-based arguments about why this care is important, why access is important, and why this all lives within the same world of values that we talk about. Erin, I'll go to you first, and then TL. How do you talk about, the sort of values of bodily autonomy? How do you, sort of make that argument or get people to sort of buy into that space of like, why is this important to us, whether or not you're somebody who needs gender-affirming care or reproductive care today?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that there's a lot of different kinds of gender-affirming care that cisgender people use, right? And I think we so often talk about gender-affirming care as like it's only a thing that like trans people access. No, a lot of people access gender-affirming care, cisgender people included. And so I think really helping people understand that the goal is not to just like only ban abortion at some point and then only ban gender affirming care for trans people. That is absolutely not the point. That is not the point at all. The point is to control every single facet of our lives so that a very small part of this country gets to determine how every single person looks and acts and what their lives are like, right? And so I think that's the first part, is to help people understand that it's not like right now it is targeted at a specific group of people, but the goal includes almost all of us. The second part, when we're talking about framing about gender affirming care, when we're talking about framing like this, it helps to start with a value and then with the opposition. So if you just go right in with what the problem is, people are less dial in to start with something like, regardless of what we might feel about it, we all know that we'd like to access the medical care that's appropriate for us when we need it without the government getting involved. But right now they're, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of how we work through the messaging. That's true for almost every issue. Start with the value we all share, and then go into the problem. And then the last part too is, making it like every person, whether they're a parent or not, when they hear about specific laws, especially ones that are about children, they imagine themselves as a parent and they're like, well, I would never, or I would always, right? And so sometimes messaging that helps kind of take it down from like, but you would like to make that decision with your child, right? You would like to be able to make that decision without the opinions and beliefs of other people coming into your life to tell you what you have to do. And I think reframing it around the right to parent your children or the right to actually have control over your own life is a broad value that we all share. Did I answer your question, or did I go astray? Because I did. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'll build off of that. And I think, echoing the first thing that Erin said, trans issues become cis issues very quickly. A really good example of that is like a lot of banning trans youth from participating in sports. How quickly that turns from banning trans youth to genital checks on all children, right? Which, that is something that I think no one wants, no matter who you are. And so this, and like Erin said, this doesn't just stay with trans people. This continues to reverberate and continues. So I think that's one thing, is you are more related to the issues that trans people are fighting for right now than you think. And you are not that far removed from trans people. You probably know a trans person. You've seen trans people on TV. Maybe your kid goes to school with someone who's trans and you've held conversations. You are closer to this issue than you think you are, which kind of goes into I think the best way to talk about this is if you have personal stories. And that's how you build some of those those value statements that Erin was mentioning. Like, obviously I'm a trans person, so I can bring that up and I can talk about my own experience as a trans person in the world, but you might have a trans friend. And obviously, you know, don't share all their personal secrets, but you can talk about like, hey, I have a friend who really, really struggles to get the care that they need, or I have a friend who fought really hard to get gender affirming care, even while it's legal, you know, all of these pieces, because when we have those big values of autonomy, making medical decisions about ourselves, if we connect it somehow personally, that typically brings people along. Because otherwise they're just abstract things that can be really, really tough. Because again, people are like, well, I don't know trans people. I don't know anything about it. And you don't need to. It's okay. You know, you don't need to know what it's like to be a trans person in order to care. And so I think finding those threads to get people to be like, oh, I can relate to that is so important.
Yeah, that's true with sports, especially too, is that there has been so much work done in the media and like over the course of time to paint trans people as like dangerous or threats, right? And so like especially when we're talking about sports, like all people play sports, especially kids, for the same reasons, right? It's for like teamwork and to learn how to share and to like be outside and be with their friends, and reminding people of that, like it takes them out of this different part of their brain and back to like, oh yeah, like I played kickball because it was like fun kickball at recess, not for like, and you know, there's no gold medals for kickball. It's just like ducking and not getting the ball to the face, or like running for that base and sliding and skinning your knee. Like that's all we do when we play sports, right? And that's the reason trans kids play sports, and it's the reason cisgender kids play sports, it's the reason non-binary kids play sports, right? And so just bringing people back to like things that we know that are so easy to forget in some of the heightened rhetoric that gets put about.
I think we mentioned this earlier, but cis people have gender too, like, you know, which I think people forget, like, without maybe realizing it. Cis people think a lot about their gender. I mean, you wear the clothes you do, you show up to work, you know, wearing certain outfits to affirm your gender. You get your ears pierced to affirm your gender. You do certain activities. Like, it is not just trans people who want to feel affirmed in their gender. It's not just trans people who express their gender in certain ways. And I often think it is like posited as it's just trans people. I'm like, no, we all do gender. Like, that's the whole point. Like, gender is a societal construct and we are all finding our place within that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I consider myself a lip stain lesbian. Elise, my wife, is like a chapstick lesbian. And like I do high femme, like I love it. It is like who I've been my whole life. And like I think about my gender a lot and do a lot of things to affirm it, right? And that is true, but a lot of people don't think about it when they do that. And involving the government into some people is just so weird and creepy.
Yeah, and I think, you know, sort of dovetailing off of the athletics thing for just a second, I think, you know, one of the great examples of the harms of, you know, sort of not looking at these as interrelated subjects is the ways in which at an international level, especially, but at a national level, some of the bans on, you know, trans folks or the restrictions on participation in athletics have primarily been impacting cisgender women who have heightened levels of testosterone naturally occurring. And there's a couple of, you know, really classic examples. Caster Semenya is sort of the, you know, key one of, you know, really highly competitive, one of the best Olympic runners, was asked to take hormone blockers to compete and declined to do so. And, you know, I think that's the fundamental risk of putting in these sort of very technical, but not well thought out, not ethically, you know, decided restrictions, is that you're going to have these unintended consequences. If your consequence is preventing really fantastic athletes from competing on an international stage, is that really the outcome that you want? And unfortunately, you know, the history of things like gender testing in sports just has all of these deeply intertwined racialized undertones of what it means to be, you know, female in a sort of international sense. And, you know, that is the danger here, is that when we allow these movements to take hold, they look at all these sort of pseudo-scientific ways of trying to, you know, sort of cloak what is effectively just restrictions on people's bodies and the ways that they're presenting themselves in the world. And, you know, fundamentally, that doesn't align with my values. And I think it doesn't align with most people's values, but often that gets missed in the sort of technical arguments and, you know, discussions around fairness and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of grounding us back into, you know, kind of the reproductive rights and gender, you know, gender affirming care intersection. TL, what has been most useful for you sort of going back and forth between those two? Like, what have you gained the most out of sort of knowledge of gender affirming care and trans issues that you brought into repro spaces, and vice versa? What have you brought from repro spaces into gender affirming care work and work with trans folks?
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that I'll name is our Planned Parenthood North Central States Health Centers. They, for at a vast majority of them, we also provide gender affirming care for people. So it is literally in the same space, you know, and I think autonomy, which I feel like I learned a lot about autonomy in repro spaces, but I feel like I've dove deeper into autonomy in trans spaces. Just like the concept behind, yeah, gender freedom and thinking of are like expanding our rights that we have. I also think a lot about vulnerability politics, which has cadence between both reproductive spaces and trans spaces of who and when is the government deeming people vulnerable. Oftentimes we see a lot of anti-abortion laws get moved forward because we are protecting women, or, you know, women are incapable of making decisions, you know, and things along those lines. So we see restrictions and ways that we doubt their autonomy and their ability to say, no, this is what I want, which we see the same thing in trans spaces of people not trusting trans people to know what's best for them and know the paths that they want to take. And again, when we think about vulnerability politics of like trans people, who is made vulnerable, you know, for political gain, which in the case we're seeing a lot, kids are the vulnerable ones that we have to protect trans people against. We also see kids showing up in repro spaces too, that we have to protect the children or the, you know, the unborn fetus, you know, and so there's just, yeah, I think I keep picking up like little pieces and finding, oh wait, this can go over here too. Oh, I think Erin at one point said it's just circle. And I think the other thing is expanding when we say reproductive care, what are we thinking about? And it isn't just pregnancy. It isn't just contraception. It is, you know, in vitro fertilization. It is other procedures to be able to have kids in other ways, shape, or form. It goes beyond, I think, what we traditionally think of. And I feel like my transness, bringing that into a repro space, has allowed me to like be like, what else falls into this reproductive justice space? And if we're thinking, especially from a repro justice lens, like, yeah, like clean, healthy air, like safe schools, you know, it reverberates further. So I feel like we have a fuller and more complete look at reproductive care and reproductive rights, reproductive justice when we include trans issues. So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, and then I'll pass it to you, Erin, one of the things that I really appreciate about both spaces, and I'm constantly reminded of, is how each movement has really struggled with racial justice issues over its history. LGBTQ rights in particular, for a long time, you know, sort of sidelined trans issues and, you know, those things as being both, you know, sort of more messy and complicated, but also being smaller proportionally parts of the population. And so trans folks, trans women of color in particular, were left on the sidelines. And that's reflected in the inequalities we see within our movement work today. And so, you know, the same can be said about reproductive rights spaces. There have been tons of BIPOC folks who have been really deeply engaged in the work, but the central, you know, sort of movement forces have not always been inclusive. And so, you know, looking at both and figuring out how do we grow, how do we embrace the folks who have been, you know, working really hard, even if they've been on the margins, how do we bring them into the space, I think has been, you know, a shared commonality across both that I think we have important work to do. I think for me, you know, sort of bringing from the, you know, sort of trans lens into the reproductive freedom lens is really looking at like that sort of range of care. I think a lot of folks, you know, assume that, you know, reproductive rights access is just about abortion access, which is critical and important, and we need to talk about it. But it's, you know, that bigger picture, as you shared, TL, like it's, you know, that access to all of these different things that help us plan for our lives and our bodies and our families and futures. And, gender affirming care, having that knowledge and that experience that like gender affirming care isn't just one thing. It's not one set of hormones or surgeries or anything like that. And that it can look like all of these different things allows you to envision a world where people are sort of customizing their healthcare and their decisions based on their own needs, which fundamentally is what we should all be doing. And so, being able to see that bigger picture because of my experience with gender affirming care and knowing that like, when I was first, kind of coming into my own as a trans person, I saw a very narrow vision of what it meant to be trans and what gender affirming care looked like that didn't align with what I felt like I needed. And as I learned more and was able to expose myself to more trans folks who had different experiences, I was like, oh, wait, that lines up in a different way. And I think, for folks who maybe, have only interacted with reproductive freedom work in one facet of that, getting a bigger picture and understanding that this is all part of this bigger work, I think opens up space for people to have access to conversations about it and to relate their own experiences and say, yeah, this is actually a reproductive rights conversation, even if I didn't imagine it in that way to begin with. And I think, what I've really gained from working with the abortion rights and reproductive rights space is the sort of long game that like the legal landscape changes, right? The social landscape can change around this. We're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep doing this work, but being really creative about it in that long game. Like, there are just so many ways in which reproductive freedom folks have engaged on DIY levels, on legal levels, on all of these different layers of like, how do we create continuity and access to care, not just like the physical medical care itself, but like networks of care and networks of aid and networks of knowledge for folks that, I think, the LGBTQ movement has pieces of, but I think there's a real depth of experience and, understanding that we can draw on from that abortion and reproductive rights space that our movement can grow from as well.
I'll just jump in really quick. I think also the messaging, like I learned a lot about like how to talk about abortion when we're talking, in communities and the messaging. And it's so similar to how we're going to message about queer and trans issues, making sure that we're not like regurgitating anti-talking points, but like using language that addresses it. Also like naming things beyond just saying like, oh, it's those bullies out there. Well, who are they? Like, what are they doing? They're not just random bigots. They are people making decisions very specifically. And so I feel like being able to like use that same like approach in our messaging is like so critical too.
So much just went through my mind, but and because you both did such a great job of talking about like within the movement, like what you learn movement to movement, I'll just, because yes to all of that. The things that I have learned or that I share across movement, I mean, they're the same movement. Like gender justice works in reproductive justice, health rights and justice, and trans and LGBT liberation. Like they are the same fight to us, same opponents, same people we're fighting for. But the thing that I've come to share that I got from both intertwined that I like always come back to is how deeply rooted in white supremacy the opposition to reproductive freedom is, to trans and LGBT liberation is. And I'm just going to give you two examples. So the first one, and I'm just going to do a little content warning because I'm going to repeat a quote that is really horrendous, but it's important. There was Captain Pratt. He was one of the like manifest destiny people who came to the United States to colonize the US. And he was the one that did the quote of "kill the Indian, save the man." And was the kind of the forefather of these horrendous indigenous schools where they stole children and assimilated them. The reason the quote was "kill the Indian, save the man" was not a stand-in for human, but it was actually because he encountered two-spirit individuals who were like wearing skirts and not aligning with a gender that he could discern. And so it was very specifically to institute gender norms amongst indigenous people in the United States. And then for reproductive rights, Horatio Storer, a very staunch white supremacist, kind of came up with these myths about abortion in the 1800s. And it was that abortion was unsafe and it was dirty and that like women didn't really know what their minds were. And so like they couldn't be trusted to make these decisions on their own. So like things that we still see to this day replicating through the anti-abortion movement. And so just, the anti-abortion movement, the current one actually was founded around organizing racist white voters in the South around an issue because they couldn't say we oppose the integration of public schools. I mean, like, so just how rooted in white supremacy all of this is. And that's, Kat, I'm glad you brought up like in our own movements, like we still struggle with race and equity and all of those things, but the opposition to our existence and to our freedom is always going to be rooted in white supremacy. And until we deal with that in our own movement, we actually can't like combat it really well on the other side. So that is what's something I have learned and that I'm always keeping in the forefront of my mind.
Super appreciate that insight. And I think, you know, as we sort of wrap up and then open things up for questions, I know, you know, if you look at the landscape across the United States right now, we're in a moment that it's easy to feel deeply pessimistic about, right? Nearly half of the United States doesn't have access to abortion. Nearly half of the United States doesn't have access to gender-affirming care for youth. That was a rapid change only a year ago. You know, pre-Dobbs, we were in a very different world, and suddenly things look extraordinarily difficult on the ground. All of us are in the movement. What gives us hope to keep going? Like, in the face of all of that change, in the face of all these adversities, like, why are you still doing this work?
I'll share a quote from one of my organizers that I love looking to and reading her writing, Miriam Kaba, who says, "Let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair." And I keep that very close to myself because it is really easy to fall into this is hopeless. We can't do anything. But I think we've shown so many different victories of no, we can't. It is possible. And so I think it's continuing to remind ourselves that we as people, whether we're in big positions of power or not, do have power, and we do have the ability to change. And it starts with one, and then it turns to two and multiple. And if we get a group of people, we can do a lot. And I think from like that organizing background, I mean, like, if I get 5 friends and they call 5 friends, then we have how many, 25 people who are all down and ready to go. And so I think the other thing I think of is people really do care. That, whether it's something that they're talking about visibly or not, may be another story, but people really do. And I don't know, maybe I'm someone who I believe in people. I've seen every single day people show up and share personal stories. People go out of their way to make sure that their neighbors are cared for. I've seen, and I think thinking about coalition work, so many organizations showing up for each other, whether or not it's directly their issue. Like, all of these things coming together helps us shift power. It's going to take time. And I think, again, that lesson from, the abortion side of things, it is not a quick process. It is going to be slow. We might have to defend wins that we've gotten. And sometimes it just looks like sitting down with your uncle at Thanksgiving and being like, we gotta touch on a few things here. And that it moves. So even the smallest pieces moves us forward. So, and then, I think it's okay to feel like things are bad and hopeless. I think that's healthy, but that should not be your dominant. Take your time to grieve. And I think we all should be grieving, in so many different ways. Grief is not a bad emotion. It's just a tough one. But then we can take that and turn it into something. And we can use that to, move us forward. So those are a few things for me.
Erin, what keeps you going?
Well, I mean, doing this work in community, right? Like, we are meant to be in community, doing this work in community, doing it alongside people who I know have it if I need to take a minute, and who I know that I've got them if they need to take a minute. TL, I love that you shared that quote, because I never quote myself, but something I say a lot is, the last act of oppression is not death, it's despair. It's to convince you that nothing can change, so it's not worth trying. So if we buy into despair, then we will, that's the whole point, is to be like, doesn't matter how hard you try, it doesn't matter what you do, it's not going to change. That's not true. And so we need to keep trying. And the other thing that keeps me going is knowing that our opponents, while well-resourced and like having enough kind of, circular information vacuums to like circulate some of their crap, are not smart enough to have new playbooks. The playbook that they're using on trans people right now is the same thing that they used on abortion. So like, we're already that far ahead of them, and we can like get a far enough ahead. Like, they keep losing in court already. They're like legally some of the dumbest people I've ever seen try to pass laws. So that is that, like, it's a little bit of like petty joy that I'm just like, well, we have all the great people. And so, and then there's a lot of people that are gettable. People don't want to feel bad about humanity. And when they're being told to feel bad about humans all the time, like it doesn't feel good. It's why we're increasingly encouraged to isolate from one another, is because the more you're around people, the more likely you're all to be like, yeah, those people suck. And so I believe in our ability to like be with each other and be in community and like pull people back towards that light and towards each other. And it is that hard work. It might be an uncle at a table. It might be like, you know, a neighbor down the street, but like living our lives fully and authentically in and of itself, like with joy, that is resistance. And that is something every time I think about being happy, I'm like, well, this is part of the work, baby. So that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, I'm always reminded within the LGBTQ movement work, especially, of coming back to the HIV/AIDS crisis when we lost effectively a generation of LGBTQ folks. But the ways in which our community showed up in the middle of just absolute devastation, and not only like advocated on behalf of what we needed in terms of healthcare and policy and things like that, but like created art and beauty and joy in the midst of deep grief. Like the AIDS quilt is such a powerful statement of not just like giving into that sense of despair, but being able to take something that's deeply painful and creating some beauty and movement out of it that led to change and led to fundamental differences. We're in a fundamentally different world for HIV and AIDS than we were in 1986. And you know, those are the kind of things that remind me that when we continue to show up with our joy and our beauty and our creativity around these movements, we can move through even the most difficult of circumstances. And, you know, when I look back at, you know, Roe v. Wade and the, you know, sort of Dobbs decision and everything that's transpired since, that was 50 years of conservative movement work to get to that one decision. It's not going to change overnight, but if we continue to organize in the right ways, we can be in a wholly different spot 50 years from today and having a wholly different conversation about all these things if we do the right work. And I believe fundamentally that that change can happen, and it starts at a small level, as TL said, with your uncle or, you know, with your friend or your neighbor, and believing that your movement work, that your conversations can make a difference for the positive and for the better.
And also there's like more of us now, and we have more power now. Like we are in the halls of power. We are at the tables of power. We have set our own tables of power and decentralized. And so like, that is also, you know, it's not going to take us 50 years to undo this because, you know, there weren't even like gay lawmakers at the time, right? Like there are a bunch of us now. We got a whole caucus. And it's like, that is really, really beautiful too, that work that we've done in community has yielded such incredible things. And they were unignorable. We're a full like 20% of the population. What are they gonna do, ignore us? We're so pretty.
What a wonderful note to end on there. Would love to get any questions for any of our panelists here. Curiosities folks might have about the intersections of these issues or anything else in that general galaxy.
A general galaxy, I love it.
All right, so I'll read off this question in the chat here. Many in our networks have raised that even if opposition movements are advocating for policies that may not come to fruition, perhaps they're in a blue region or state, it still provides a platform for disinformation. Can you share more about joint ways to combat false information and/or resources you turn to combat misinformation and instead elevate facts, accurate information, and shifting the narrative? For example, you've already shared great narrative today that reminds folks why we are all effective. Do you have FAQs shared by your orgs that folks can refer to? And do you coordinate with other orgs to have resources that folks can reference? I'll say for OutFront, certainly we have some FAQ informations and resource links and things like that. I think the biggest thing, here in Minnesota this year, we had 3 bills introduced at a state legislative level that were harmful anti-LGBTQ bills. Particularly there was a ban introduced for gender-affirming care for minors that was then amended to a bunch of different bills that went throughout the legislature. And so there was this constant need to kind of beat back that same narrative framework and at least have good talking points to address those things. And I think the 2 pieces that, stick in my mind is one, the basic facts and information are really important. But again, coming back to that values-based framework of like, we're not going to bully children. We're not going to get in the way of healthcare providers making the right decisions with families. Like, those are the things that ultimately shift hearts and minds. People aren't convinced by seeing, a set of JAMA studies on the impacts of gender-affirming care, unless you're that kind of person, and there are a handful of us. But for the most part, people are convinced by being able to see the impact of gender-affirming care on somebody they know or love or can relate to. And, so grounding it, resources are really important, info is really important, but also just repeating those narratives and having, trans folks and, folks who have accessed abortion in all of these movements sharing their stories. Fundamentally, that's what people relate to the most.
Yeah, I'll just, so one of the most visited pages on Gender Justice's websites is our FAQ about trans inclusion in sports. And like, it's old. I wrote it many years ago. It is not what I would write today. And so I can share the link, but I'm in the process of rewriting it. I think, much like Kat said, like, there are people who are going to be maybe convinced by JAMA studies, but not many. And I think one of the hardest parts is that there are people, I kind of put them into 3 buckets. For Repro, like 77% of Minnesotans are with us. We actually don't have to convince any more people. We've kind of hit that ceiling. There's a general understanding about how important it is to be able to access pregnancy care throughout pregnancy. When it comes to trans inclusion, it is, there's a huge squishy middle, right? So there's like 20% of people who are firmly against trans and LGBT people. There's like 14% that are like firmly for, and then there's a huge squishy middle that are like, I don't know. They're super susceptible to messaging. The difficult parts for folks is that one, sometimes they feel like they're being asked to like deconstruct their own gender or everything that they know about gender, or deconstruct everything that they've ever learned because everything is wrong. And that's really hard. And so not trying to like go in and be like, gender is a construct, and that, although, because that's not always helpful for like my mom, but like pronouns for her, I was like, some people like to be called Miss, Ms, or Mrs, and it's just polite to refer to people, like that was relatable enough for her, and that was enough, and that's all she needed. So kind of going back to these, bigger things of like, I don't think I know everything about gender affirming care, but I do know that I want to be able to get the healthcare my kid needs. Or like the people who are trying to ban healthcare, like, don't we have roads to pave? Like, kind of going back to like, is this really the focus that we should be all spending our time on, is like banning healthcare for kids? Are these doctors? No, so just kind of putting it into context of how unimportant it is in terms of scope. Like, why are they focusing all their ire on less than 1% of the population, most of whom are children? What is it that they should be focusing on, or what is it that they don't want us focusing on, right? And so instead of like elevating facts, like more redirecting to like, what I do know is important is that like parents can get their kids healthcare, that kids have the healthcare they need, and all kids and all kinds of healthcare, right? So instead of banning some kids' healthcare, like, shouldn't we be expanding healthcare to everybody? So just kind of doing those things. That's what I have found to be really helpful, is reframing around what is actually important, that value, the problem, and then maybe redirect to a different thing that we wish they'd be focusing on, like all the potholes my car keeps sinking into, or the fact that like it's really hard to get your license renewed, or I don't know, I'm focusing on vehicular things so much. But actually I do know why. There's a trans lawmaker out in Virginia, and every time they like brought up her gender identity, she was like, yeah, but I really want to fix the road down the street. And so I think it's important to do that. Yeah, it was a Assemblywoman Danica Rome, I think is the person. So anyway, that's my suggestion.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'll just in agreement. I think one thing that I mentioned this before, but I'll emphasize again, do not repeat or amplify opposition messaging or disinformation, even if it is to refute that information. Just send out that counter narrative, the messaging we want. We don't want to give it any more traction. We don't want to get those buzzwords any more stuck in people's brains than they might already be. So that's one big suggestion. And this is for repro or for trans, but I think it's just good information. And I think one thing we're doing a lot at Planned Parenthood is bringing our volunteers along with us, because we do know that there's a chunk of our volunteers who are not so on board with this, even though they're on board with repro. And so finding those connections through autonomy. And so we've been working of holding like trainings and informational sessions for our volunteers to learn more about like what is going on and why do we care? Why is Planned Parenthood going to the Capitol and showing up for LGBTQ related things, but then also giving our volunteers some of those myth busting tactics to be able to start in their own life, and then eventually we can incorporate that into future things. And one of the links that I have to share at the end is we actually have a anti-trans legislation and anti-trans myth busting training coming up. So I'll send a link to that if you want to join us. But I also will just, someone I look to a lot, who is a trans scientist and author, Julia Serrano. She has a ton of articles, and I just kind of listed the link where she like sits down and like, let's understand what the anti-transparent movement looks like, what, the words grooming and social contagion, where do they come from and why, so it gives a little bit more context that I think is helpful to when we're then discussing in the future. So I like looking to Julia Serrano and other trans scholars who are and other movement makers who are doing some of these things. So I just wanted to shout out someone that I read a lot of Julia Serrano stuff and I find it super helpful.
We had a question up here from John. Has OutFront and Planned Parenthood been receiving requests from folks from Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, other states that are restricting gender-affirming care? What can we share with our LGBTQ plus siblings who live in those states to give them hope? I think, for me, one of the pieces, yes, we have been, absolutely. Over the course of the spring, there were, a couple peak times where we were getting dozens of calls per week at OutFront from folks in neighboring states. That's continued. Luckily, we're in a space right now where some of the litigation has meant that some of those bans have been now put under injunction and folks can stay at least for a temporary period of time where they're at. But I think folks are still very nervous. And I think, the biggest things that we can do, we've convened a number of different groups to talk about how we can support folks here. But, what folks have said to me repeatedly is that the work that we're doing in Minnesota to advance protections, to talk about these issues, to get broader support is giving people hope that that continued work is going to bear out across the country. And that hope is really important right now to just keep people sustained. Whether or not they decide to move to Minnesota, whether or not they need to access care in Minnesota, when I get calls from folks in Tennessee and Kentucky saying that Minnesota is giving them hope, it reminds me that we're doing the right work. And I think, fundamentally here in Minnesota, we need to keep doing that right work. We need to be that refuge to people, whether they're accessing abortion or whether they're accessing gender-affirming care. We have the protections in place. We need to do what we can to support those networks to make sure that that promise of access actually materializes into access for folks. But I do think it will be a growing need and an evolving need as we watch litigation and legislation change over the next year to 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, another thing, Gender Justice works in North Dakota as well. And, one of the things that we know is that because we are in a state where, we might have like legal protections, that doesn't change hearts and minds on the ground, right? So we might have, it might be like, legal for trans kids to play sports that align with their gender identity. But if their school's giving them a really hard time about it, if they're being bullied, like that doesn't actually create the space that we want to. And so making sure that it's permeating down. And then as we kind of change the conditions on the ground, how do we share those resources with other states as well, so that as they're fighting some of these really big fights to just have the legal right to exist, they can also work on those other pieces that create better conditions on the ground with resources that we can give them, so that some of that labor is shared across movements. But yes, the fact that we exist in the way we do is giving people hope. And then I really just want to name too that it's both about the conditions on the ground, but a lot of this is targeted around the healthcare that people access, whether it's abortion care or gender affirming care. And so making sure that this state not only is a safe place for people to provide and receive that care, that we're investing in people to provide that care, because it doesn't matter if it's legal if there's nobody there to give it to you. So making sure that we are continuing to build that pipeline and have people who reflect the community be in those positions of providing. So those are some of the things that we're working on, and the states around us are really doing it.
They sure are. And from, thinking, I don't know for sure from our Planned Parenthood North Central States health centers, like if we've seen an increase in care. I would not be surprised if we have. I do know that something that we've hired a few people to be LGBT care coordinators and kind of navigators to help people find other options. And we have a similar program we have patient navigators who help people find abortion or figure out, logistic things. And so we're having our care coordinators who are fielding a lot more questions and a lot more people who are scared, wanting to know, especially in our states where we've had to stop providing hormones to youth because of the law. And our health center staff has really worked hard to pivot and meet those moments while trying to provide resources, which is a really thin needle to thread, is continuing to provide resources even though we can't provide the thing that the people want because of law. So I think it very similar to abortion. We are seeing Minnesota become this kind of island of access, this safe haven. We are seeing people come here because of our laws, and so similar to what Kat said, I know that fighting for these LGBTQ legislative related fights matters, and it can shift, and I know too many trans people who are moving to Minneapolis, to the Twin Cities, to Minnesota from other states. And so it would, I think we're going to continue to see those kind of fluctuations. I mean, even personally, I'm thinking about going back into a PhD program, and I'm like looking at where all the different schools are, and I'm like, oh, half of them are in states where I'm illegal in some way, shape, or form. So, it is quickly limiting opportunities. And so if we can continue to find opportunities and ways to provide opportunities in the states that are good and safe, that is going to be so crucial. And that's and it's not just Planned Parenthood. It's not just it's everyone putting together and pitching in and finding ways that they can make their spaces inclusive, so we can accommodate these fluctuations, accommodate these, share the burden of resources that we're going to have to continue to give out. And that's what we're here for, right? Is to come together and share those resources. But we can do it together better, and we can reach more people, which I think is, it's going to continue to increase, and for good and bad reasons.
I just want to add one more thing, and it's that, Minnesota is notorious for being a really hard state to be a transplant in. And so one of the things that's really on each of us is try to figure out, especially post-pandemic, how are we just creating opportunities for people to just be together and meet people and make friends? Some of us should just make new friends, and they should be people who moved here, because we're notoriously cold people, both literally and metaphorically. So I think that is something that all of us can do. It's my goal this year, is to make a new friend who's not from Minnesota, just to be we're not going to alienate you.
And with that, I love that note on Minnesota ice. But yes, thank you for that. So I know we're just going into closing now. So thank you so much, Erin, TL, and of course, Kat. So some things to just wrap up with how to get involved. So please do follow the leadership of folks that you've heard here today, and other LGBTQ plus movement leaders. Support the work of those groups and organizations. Learn, gather, and be in community. Have conversations, like Erin said, find a new friend, make a new friend, and give to sustain the movement, which has been really critical as a major call to action for our philanthropic partners. Building the work takes time, and we need very bold, generous giving and contributions from everybody in our work here. So, and on the next slide, we have some resources, and we'll also send these to folks as they come up too. So you'll see the websites for some of our speakers and then also some other resources. So thank you so much for that. On the next slide, please catch us on our last conversation, which is part 3. Yes, thanks, Jen. Oh, there we go. Quickly. Safer communities for LGBTQ plus means safer whole communities. So we'll really talk about this culture of collective care and the networks of care and knowledge, like Kat mentioned. So we're really excited to have some conversations with folks from, legal aid to others who have been part of systemic change. So thank you again, Kat, and to our speakers. And with that, I just want to end with a couple of quotes. Actually, today is Grace Lee Boggs' birthday, so just want to honor her for a moment. Yes, but one of my favorite quotes from her, she talks about, "I'm often asked about what keeps me going after all these years, and I think it is a realization that there is no final struggle. Whether you win or lose, each struggle brings forth new contradictions, new and more challenging questions." So it's a deep time of deep change, not just of social structure and economy, but also of ourselves. If we want to see change in our lives, we have to change things ourselves. So with that, thank you so much to TL, Erin, and of course, Kat and others for joining us. And we'll see you at the next conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.